Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here today with Fritz Breithaupt. Thanks for joining me for this discussion.
Thank you for having me, Edwin.
So let me give you a little background about you. You're a professor of Germanic studies and a provost professor at Indiana University at Bloomington. I had to look up the word provost professor. So it says it's an outstanding interdisciplinary scholar appointed by a senior administrative officer. And you're also you founded and direct the Experimental Humanities Laboratory at Indiana University. And what we're here to talk about is empathy. And you're the author of this book, The Dark Sides of Empathy. So yeah, great. Is there more you'd like to add by way of introduction about yourself?
That sounds perfect. That sounds perfect. I should say that I'm also doing, teach a lot of courses in cognitive science. So in my work, I try to bridge questions of large kind of humanities interest. Things that have to do with the arts and our way how we think about these things, aesthetical phenomena. But I also try to link them with empirical data, with the ways how our brain processes information, how we think in terms of narratives, and how, of course, in this case, then empathy works in the real world.
Okay, great. So it's interdisciplinary. You're coming at it as a interdisciplinary scholar. You're kind of looking at it from kind of all kinds of different fields, sounds like.
Yeah, I think that's true. Although, interdisciplinary is always a kind of a dubious thing nowadays. If you have not one discipline, you can easily become vague or general, and no one really knows how to verify what you're saying any longer. So what I'd like to say is that a good work always defines its own disciplines and sets up its own limitations and its own kind of criteria to say, okay, this is a good claim, this is a bad claim. How can we falsify information? So in that sense, I think there is no true interdisciplinary work. Every work creates its own discipline, but it can be a discipline that didn't exist before.
Oh, okay.
And that's increasingly true for scholarship and for science.
Great. So what we're going to be talking about empathy, and I'm advocating for a culture of empathy, saying we need to make empathy a primary social, global, social and cultural value, and for fostering, general well-being. And you're saying that, as I understand it, which we'll talk about, is that empathy has a lot of problems and some dark sides to it. Is that
yes, that captures it to some degree. Now, I am not against empathy. I do think empathy makes us human. I think our brain really may have, from all the evidence we have, may have developed to such an amazing degree because of empathy. We are the species with empathy. And empathy is first of all, a very good thing. So in that sense, we actually not that far apart. Mm-hmm. However, once you kind of want to champion empathy, I think one should be aware of a lot of the more dark sides or negative aspects and bad forms of behavior that emerge from empathy. So I would say I would also probably in most cases champion empathy. But then there's cases where I'd say, no, we need to know a lot about empathy before we can harness it, before we can say, oh yeah, we need to teach more empathy. There's enough cases where it backfires, enough of negative cases, about which we probably will talk about today.
Yeah. So you're saying, okay, if I get this, that you're not against empathy. You're saying we want to promote empathy, but you want to see what the sort of the negative aspects of it are, be aware of what the negative aspects are to,
Yes, and there are unfortunately quite a few of those negative aspects. So that's exactly what I want to think about.
Okay, cool. Well, the main problem I'm seeing in this empathy work is that the definitions are all over the place. I never know what people are talking about. In my experience, I've talked to a lot of people. I've interviewed like Dan Batson. We've gone through his 8 definitions of empathy. I've talked to a lot of people. So it gets very confusing, and even for me, who have worked on this for like 14 years, on the topic of empathy, I'm not even really sure what people are talking about when they talk about empathy. And if I'm confused, I can't imagine what it is for just the average person. So I thought we could just really go into perhaps in depth, like, what are we talking about? Or, what are you meaning by empathy? What I'm meaning by empathy? So we can really set this stage to, be clear, because, it's really going to affect all the, the everything else. And so, I guess we could start with what you're meaning. I know you talk about co-experience, and you're in your introduction, you say, I define empathy as the co-experience of another situation, though I also consider and discuss research that leads to different definitions. And so maybe you could just start with your, how are you defining it? What do you mean? And then I can share my views and what other people.
I would love to learn more about this.
A little bit.
Absolutely. So I would say, you already kind of hinted at my definition, co-experiencing the situation of another. But before I get there, I would kind of give you like my map of empathy. Cool. And as you said, Dan Batson distinguishes between 8 notions of empathy, how people have used the term. I tend to kind of differentiate between more like 4 notions. There is a general first notion of helping others, cooperation, pity. You see someone in need, you do something, you cooperate. That's more a behavior kind of definition. We see helping happens. The second definition is one of understanding. We understand what someone else is thinking or feeling. Sometimes that's called theory of mind, cognitive empathy, and has different labels as well. The third definition is the one by the neuroscientists to talk about the sharing of affects. You observe someone who is in pain or is very happy, and that leads you to activate the same kind of neuronal mechanism so that you feel, and you can be measured to feel this, sad, or you feel the pain, or you feel happy as well. So that is the definition of affect sharing. So we know basically now from some data that at least what I call the second and the third, the understanding the emotions of others and the sharing of the emotions of others use independent networks in the brain from each other. So we know that we actually kind of equipped with at least 2 different mechanisms of doing something that's called empathy. And they can be activated completely independently from each other and with different goals and in different contexts. So we know basically there's a lot of empathy in us. So it is confusing indeed. The word empathy may just be a little bit too rough, coarse term for this. The definition I use tries to bring a couple of these notions together by saying that you co-experience the situation of another. There is both an understanding component, cognitive component in that sense, but there's also one of sharing the emotions and sharing the situations of it. I'm trying to show and say that in most cases, not in all, the understanding of the situation of another and the sharing of the emotions go hand in hand. Often the one can activate the other one. You see, oh, this person is in need, or this is their situation. I understand it intellectually from a cold distance, but then often that triggers on a secondary level, emotional kind of affect sharing, emotional sharing. And I also want to show that some of these things that neuroscientists can measure, immediate pain, you see pain, you feel the pain of the other, even though you know it's not your own pain, but it's there in your brain. But this how neuroscientists define it is usually something that is immediate and only works for strong, clear emotions. But there's more complex situations. You observe someone who has to make a hard decision. And then you see they're struggling. And you can develop something that I think we should call empathy for that, even though you may not be struggling over the same kind of decision. You may not share the same emotions, but you can have empathy for their situation and their hardship in that. You can accompany them. You can feel with them. And that's one of the situations where I feel like a little bit wider term, like co-experiencing of the situation of another, captures something a little bit better.
Okay. Oh, is there more? Or
there's one more thing that I like to throw in. Most people who have worked on empathy come from psychology or neuroscience or evolutionary biology. But I think they have often neglected one other field, which is the arts and the humanities. There is something interesting that when we read a novel or watch a movie, that something happens that is fairly similar to what we would call empathy. It's not quite the same, obviously. You will not end up helping the character in the novel, but there's something where you nevertheless slip into the shoes of someone else. You develop strong emotions and feelings for these people, and their life become yours. And so I think if we want to have a full understanding of empathy, we also have to consider those aspects. Sometimes they're called transportation, or also empathy, of course, or narrative empathy. Suzanne Keen calls this narrative empathy.
Okay.
And I think that's important to bring this together.
Yeah, that's great. So the approach that the kind of the foundation of how I'm thinking of empathy comes from out of the psychology world from Carl Rogers. So he was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. He was he's considered one of the top 3 clinical psychologists who, he was using empathy in his therapeutic work, and he, defined it, and really, so he had the experiential as well as sort of the academic, scientific, combining the two aspects. So he was, his definition was, it means entering the private perceptual world of the other and becoming home at it, and that you're sort of like a companion with the person in their journey. So you're kind of being present and with that. So in terms of, for example, another critic of empathy is Paul Bloom, and I could not understand what his definition of empathy was. It's like until he finally said, he explained it this way, that you go to a therapist and you're like really angry, right? And you share your anger. Oh, I'm really angry. I'm really mad. And then your therapist, he was defining empathy as a therapist getting angry as well. And so that's sort of like a state matching, right? It's like your state of anger, the therapist matches that state. But for me, that's not even really empathy, because that's just sort of like, and you don't even know why that person is doing, the therapist is state matching. Like a tip in terms of the Carl Rogers empathy, he would not be saying it's the state matching. He would be trying to say, oh, I hear you're angry, and he would be present with the anger and hear what's sort of behind the anger and take the journey of the person sort of exploring what their anger is. Like, oh, I'm angry because I was disrespected by my boss, So it's like a need, he's feeling disrespected, and he's maybe has a need for, equality or being seen and heard. So there's a whole journey that you take as with empathizing with that person. And so that's sort of a feeling into, it's sensing into the experience of, he's not like taking it on, like I'm getting angry or I'm feeling, sad or whatever. I'm just a presence with you on your journey. And so with Paul Bloom's definition, state matching is actually maybe you first empathize with the client in this case, but then you sort of have your own feelings, which actually blocks empathy. So I see that what Paul Bloom is actually doing is actually a block to empathy in my terms. So I don't even see his criticism of empathy as really valid, because he's saying something that's, kind of a block to being present with the other person. So I don't know, just if you wanted to, how that.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I want to emphasize that I like your definition, or your building blocks of a definition very much here, to say that you're on a journey with the other person. What often gets lost in the neuroscientific definition of this affect sharing is that there's a history with empathy. I mean, you don't just have it one time and then you have empathy and that's it. No, I mean, if there's a commitment following and being on a journey, it describes that quite well. You get better in understanding the other person, you go along with them, It is something that involves some work too. I mean, it's not something that just happens automatically, not this quick state matching. So I like that. I think that's an important notion to have in mind here. And indeed, it is one of the positive ones. I will talk a little bit later on about some, even in that definition, some potential dark sides.
Okay.
First of all, I think I like to hold it up to say, yes, we shouldn't forget empathy is something wonderful that allows us to get close to another person and share a life with them too, or accompany at least a segment with them, and also something that builds in more accuracy along the way, because the more you go along, the better and closer you get.
Yeah. So you're saying that it fosters, like at first you're seeing the anger of that client, but as you hear more, you're getting more accurate into the nuances of why that anger, what's the history of the anger, what is the connected feelings, and so forth. And so even in Paul Bloom's definition of state matching, it starts with empathy. He has to sense he empathically sense the anger of the other person. But then the state matching, like, oh, I'm angry because my wife just left me or something. You know, whatever. You don't know why that state matching is happening. And so, but that takes the awareness away from the other person and puts it on the person that's listening, right? So I would actually see that it starts with empathy, then it actually becomes a block in empathy.
Yes. And I like what I like about your definition too, is that there is really the development in it. You start to see where the other person is coming from, why they have certain feelings, why they're in a certain state. And then also where it goes to. I mean, you start to anticipate where could this develop, so on. And I think time factors are very important. I mean, in this, and they're part of this. So I have, since you mentioned Paul Bloom, and I guess he is the prominent person, along with Jesse Prince, the philosopher, who have said, okay, they're against empathy. But for me, it's partly a matter of a definition, but it's partly out of also a framing that I think they're getting. They have a too narrow framing, both of them in slightly different ways, but they're both heading in the same direction. Paul Bloom says that we should be against empathy because it leads us to wrong judgment. We will favor certain people more than others. He quotes this research where the participants in an experiment are explained about a queue of a vital organ transplant. They get information about the person who's in some position, not the first position, but in position 2, 3, or 4. And then this person is described to them. I'm saying why this person really needs this organ transplant. And then they get asked the question. So basically the idea is that you develop empathy for this person, you know something about it. Should this person skip the queue ahead of the others? And he says, yes, a lot of people then say, yes, this person should skip the queue because they have developed empathy for the person. And now they act unfair because the other people also probably have a story. They also need this vital organ transplant. And so he says we should be against empathy because it leads to unfair conclusions. And I think this is false on a couple of reasons, but the main one is, the main criticism I have is to say that empathy may be good for a lot of things, but maybe it's not meant for perfect judgments. There's a lot of things that are not good for perfect judgments. Love, I mean, of course, if you love someone, you're not perfectly in a position to judge this person, or if it's someone in your family of a friendship or so. Yes, you're not in a position now to be the perfect judge over them, but that's not the purpose of love, and it's not the purpose of friendship, and it's probably not the purpose of empathy either, to be the perfectly neutral judge. No, you're biased towards them because you have shared some of their journey with them. So I think basically Paul Bloom, but also Jesse Prince, are against empathy because they frame it wrongly. They put it in a context, we should make perfectly fair judgments. Empathy doesn't help us much, may even in some ways mislead us there. It can help us, but it can also mislead us. Therefore, we have to throw empathy out. And I think that's just a wrong logical conclusion, a wrong framing effect. They do not talk about the things that you talk about, closeness, social bonding, or very little. They also don't talk about the maybe more egocentric aspect of empathy, is that you live in a richer world. It's not just interesting for the other person, it's you, by having empathy, you learn about the world, you learn about other people. It's so much more rich to live in a world with empathy.
Yeah. So when you're empathizing with that person who has fear, you're experiencing the deeper aspects of where that fear comes from, and that increases the richness of your experience. You see maybe the sadness or the loss or the desire. So that's kind of the benefit that you're seeing, as I understand it, is the depth of experience that you have by empathizing or feeling into, sensing into their experience or other people's experience.
Yeah, you share the experiences of other people, so you automatically have more experiences. Good and bad, rich, more complex, more fine-tuned. You make experiences that you personally will not make. And I do think you actually make that experience along with them.
Yeah, I'm sensing I'm sensing all these different threads. The one thing you say that I already see like 10 different things, different routes to go with that. Because you did mention Jesse Prince, and I've done 2 interviews with him, actually an empathy circle. So a practice, sort of a foundational practice we can maybe talk about that he took, that's an empathy sort of a practice. So he took part in that. But, kind of looking at Jesse Prince's definition, it seems to me the core of his definition was sympathy, sort of that he's conflating empathy and sympathy, sort of a feeling sorry for someone. And again, I would say that the sympathy is actually a block to empathy. So just as Paul Bloom has a block to empathy, which is sort of the state matching, that you're angry, I get wrapped up in my own anger, which is maybe a bit self-centered, maybe even narcissistic. That instead of staying with you, I'm just, it's triggered my, anger or whatever. So you're kind of in your own world. So the attention shifted from you to me. So with Jesse Prince, his is like, I see your experience. You have some suffering. I feel sorry for your suffering. The sympathy as sort of feeling sorry for someone. And again, when you go into the sympathy, it's also a block to empathy in the sense that it's no longer about staying present with you in your anger or whatever, or your suffering, and seeing what's sort of behind that. It's like, it's about me and my sense of feeling sorry for you. So again, the feeling sorry for and sympathy takes the attention back on you. So it's no longer, and it starts with empathy, and it shifts to sort of, again, a self-centered approach. So those are the 2 definitions I see from both of them that are actually, I don't even see what they're saying is actually, they're things that are blocks to empathy for how I'm sort of defining it. So
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think Jesse Prince is very smart about these things. I mean, he's really a brilliant mind in tracing the history of certain concepts of empathy and some of the effects it has. Now he comes, and I think the word sympathy pins that down a little bit. He comes, of course, more from the Scottish Enlightenment discussions, where sympathy was the notion they used for something that we probably would call empathy today. But still, I mean, it has set him on track to look more at these aspects that then show, and then he can show how this notion of sympathy, empathy has a tendency to flip into either unfairness, this is from his article Against Empathy, or can flip into a more selfish concern, as you just described. So he puts it in a larger context there. He does not, I mean, now he also, of course, also knows some of the German context, but the second source of the notion of empathy in the modern age, I mean, there's the sympathy notion from David Hume and Adam Smith and so on. The second source of it is the German notion Einfühlung, meaning feeling in. That was a concept also from the 1700s, from the 18th century, that was developed by the German philosophers and thinkers as a task to feel yourself into an artwork, to accompany a character in a novel for a longer time period. It's closer to your notion. And that source is for Jesse Prince not an important one, I believe, or at least not a central one. It's interestingly one, historically, it's the one that gave us the notion of empathy, because this notion of Einfühlung was then translated in the early 20th century by Titchener, American psychologist, into English as the notion of empathy. He coined the word as a new word then. And that was, for me as a German, it's even funny that then in German it was back translated for his notion as empathy, which we didn't need because we had a notion, but then it became a psychological notion before, and then there had been more.
Okay, so there's different, these terms have different histories and threads, and you're kind of pointing out the different histories and the threads, and and even I think that in terms of the definition that you're talking about, Einfühlung, when it first started with sort of projection, that it's me with my feeling projecting it onto the thing, and then it sort of switched to sort of a feeling into the experience of the other. So it kind of had a switch there. And even now, the projection is sort of seen as a block to empathy, in the sense that instead of me listening to you in your anger, if in that scenario, that I am then projecting, my own thoughts onto why you maybe are angry. Like, oh, he's angry because his wife left him, or whatever. And it's not true. He's angry because, his boss, demeaned him or something, right? So you're kind of pushing your notion instead of hearing and letting it sort of unfold. So that projection now even becomes a block to empathy. So that's like another block.
Yeah. I can maybe it's okay if I take the ball from here and develop it slightly more into my model of empathy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I get clear on what you're meaning.
Yes, and I like how you describe. I mean, it's very clear, Edwin, that and I really like this, how you describe empathy as this being on a journey, along with the other, also towards better and closer understanding of the other, and where you can observe then the obstacles in this, or the blocks that throw back.
Taking that journey, Okay.
Yes, and that can be even, once you've started and embarked on the journey, it can be something, as you just described, where you suddenly kind of feel more about yourself suddenly again, or something.
You're going on your own journey. You can extend it. It's like, instead of me being on your journey, I'm going off on my journey. There's all kinds of things that pull you off on your journey.
You constantly project something, and you have to, and then of course, in life we start to learn to regulate that better. There's certain forms of empathy where older people are much better in, because they have learned this better. So there's a lifelong learning of empathy. So that's, I like that. So I use these notions of blocking empathy too, and I'll describe how I use it slightly differently.
Okay.
So what interests me is how when we actually use empathy and when we don't use it. So I'm interested in the triggers of empathy. The triggers that lead us to embark on it, to start it out, but also when we block it. Now, what interests me here is also the cultural context, the kind of people who are more likely to use it or not to use it, and then of course also the cases where it can backfire. So my general model is that we as human beings are highly equipped for a couple of forms of empathy, and we talked about some of these different forms of empathy here. But there's also something that can go too far with this. There's an involuntary form of empathy where people take advantage of us, where we get exploited and manipulated. The extreme case that I mentioned here is Stockholm syndrome, the hostage identification syndrome, where suddenly people over-identify and over-empathize with someone else to the degree that they lose their own interests out of sight. As we know from some of these hostage scenarios and other phenomena that are not as rare, like boot camp in the army and other things where you're really kind of aligned to some kind of authority figure, is that the people in it may never really come out of it again. like in a hostage situation, even when it's over, people still feel aligned afterwards. They can't come back to themselves. So I use that as a building block to say, well, there can be such a thing as too much empathy. You might not call this empathy in your case, but from my sense, I would say, yeah, there is something like an empathy process in here, being too focused on the other person. So it's actually, and this is my point here, it can be very important and very healthy for us to channel empathy, to block it in some cases and admit it and focus it in other cases. We know that in some cases, people tend to block it for other groups, the out group. That's not necessarily a good thing, obviously. We know there are slight differences between males and females in that regard. In most respects, males and females are not that different in empathy, even though most people always assume they would be so different. But in terms of blocking, there's one famous study by Tanya Singer, who observed that males and females usually behave the same. When you punish someone, they see someone in the brain scanner who gets electroshocks, they all hate it. But if they know that the person who gets the punishing kind of electroshocks had done something unfair beforehand, then the women and males reacted differently. The females still felt the pain of the other person, but to a lower degree, because that was an unfair person and may have deserved the pain, so they lowered it. But the males felt very little empathy, like pain, similarity, a reaction to it. Instead, they felt delight. So they completely blocked empathy in that case of the guilty person that they observed there. So there are differences there. So and what interests me now is then you have first, of course, this building block of hyper-empathy. Everyone has a lot of capacity for it. But then secondly, people have acquired different mechanisms of blocking it.
Okay, let me reflect back what I'm hearing so far. So you're saying that we are very empathic beings. We empathize sort of all the time. We're sort of awash, which I would agree with, is in this field of empathy with people around us, our environment, and that there are certain ways that this empathy can be blocked. And then you're just kind of going through some of the sort of how does empathy get blocked? This is kind of
and how we allow it. And then the third point is, of course, then when do we allow it? And I think people develop different kind of patterns for when we allow it. Individually or as a culture, we embrace certain things. So here in our Western culture, we tend to empathize a lot with children who are in pain. That's not true in other cultures. There's some cultures that when a kid cries, they say, no, ignore the child. And so there are cultural patterns, but there's also individual patterns that each of us learns to feel for someone else and develop something like empathy if certain starting points are there. That's what interests me.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that, just to recap, is that you see that we're sort of awash in empathy. People block the empathy, and then they overcome their blocks as well.
Yes.
So sort of what are the blocks to empathy, and how do we overcome those blocks is kind of what you're sort of wanting to explore.
Yes, and I'm interested in the patterns that come out of it. So now let me, since I talk about the dark sides here, so we want to get some, we need to communicate, but I also want to show where maybe there's some challenges now that I have.
Oh, I did want to go back before we could jump into that. You brought up quite a few points kind of along the way, and I'm already forgetting some of those I kind of wanted to respond to, to kind of slow it down, really slow, to kind of go into the. So the first thing that you were talking about, if we're using the metaphor of sort of following someone's journey, what I was hearing, and I think you've got 5 main sort of shadow sides of empathy that you go through. Each chapter of the book kind of goes through one. And that the first one that you had just mentioned was that you're following somebody's journey, and it's sort of like their journey becomes your journey and you forget your own journey in a sense, right? That's sort of like losing a sense of self, that I've taken your journey and I no longer know what my own journey is.
You adapt it as your own, exactly.
And that's the Stockholm syndrome or whatever, as so, and how do you sort of navigate or deal with that aspect. So I would say that that is an issue. So maybe we can just kind of focus on that one aspect. That, you know, in terms of Carl Rogers, he had talked about that in his therapeutic work, right? He as a therapist, he was listening to someone who was like, you know, you're going in, he says, you're into the bizarre world of some people. I mean, some people have pretty bizarre psychological worlds that they've kind of gone into. And you can go into their world and you can get lost in it. And he had someone who was like just really a, you know, difficult case, and he got lost in it. And he had to like step out of the therapy for I don't know how long it was, just to kind of reconnect with his own sense of self. So I think that's the concern. But he also says to go into the perceptual world of someone else, you have to be pretty strong to do it. It takes a certain groundedness in your own experience to kind of go on a journey. So in a sense, you're saying, well, here's one kind of negative thing that can happen is you go follow someone on their journey, their anger, their resentments, or all that, and you kind of get absorbed and you get lost and you forget what your own sense of self is, and you're not able to express that anymore. And you get kind of confused, and you're kind of getting sort of maybe even this dark, you know, sort of a space. So and
what is interesting for me here is what you were describing here is that you were describing now one of the leading clinicians of the world. Even he got into this. And he's great. This is his field. I mean, he's a professional empathy practitioner. So even in that case, a person like that can get lost in it. That indicates to us, of course, that in the wild, I mean, in the real world, this is probably fairly common. And that's what I think. But I assume that most people, of course, don't have the training or the space to just say, oh, I need to step out for a moment and think and reconnect to myself. I mean, they start wherever they are. They don't have a strong sense of self or identity. So they're much more prone to that. And that's why I'm saying this is a dark side of empathy that can hit even the professional therapist, but of course, much more likely everyone else.
Yeah. So for me, that's not a dark side of empathy in the sense that I think it actually blocks empathy. That's like to lose yourself in that way is sort of a block to empathy. And there's another aspect we didn't really would like to bring into is that I think that empathy is often seen as sort of an individualistic thing, that it's me as an individual going on this other person's journey, that, you know, I talk about a culture of empathy, that we can actually see it as a relationship. There's, you know, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, a whole society. And what is the level of empathy within the society, you know, that, so in a family, right? In a family, there's, you know, what is the level of empathy? Is everyone feeling heard and seen in the family, or is one person kind of lost and suppressed and, you know, dominated, and they've kind of lost their sense of self? So it's also to see, not only see empathy from an individualistic, and it's often seen that way even in therapy, is it's this individual, me, you kind of individual, versus seeing the relationship, and is there a healthy depth of empathy? So the person that loses themselves, they're sort of in need of empathy to sort of connect and find themselves. So that is actually, I would say, an empathy deficit, that person who is sort of losing themselves, they're in need of empathic presence to be able to find and connect to themselves. Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying? That
they need someone to have empathy with their side too.
Exactly.
So,
and there's a mutuality. So something that I do, I mean, there's a you know, the therapy model of empathy, like there's a therapist listening to the client. And what I've been focusing on is what I call the empathy circle. So we have small groups of people, like, you know, maybe 4 or so, and we do mutual active listening with each other. So you share a while, one person speaks, and and they select who's going to be their listener, and that person reflects back. Does active listening to reflect back the core of Carl Rogers' work, so that that person is heard to their satisfaction. They're heard and understood, and then and then we have maybe timed limits that create a sense of fairness. And after 5 minutes, then it's the listener's turn to select someone in the circle to reflect them back. And then they get heard. And then after 5 minutes, that person feels heard. Then it's the listener, person who was doing the reflection, then they become the speaker and they speak. So in a sense, it's saying, you will go on my journey for a while. Then someone else will go on your journey, and then someone else will go on their journey, so that we have this field of sort of mutual sharing. And that is actually sort of one of the healing aspects I find for what you're talking about is getting lost, is that you want to have people go on your journey, and by going on your journey, you will sort of find your sense of self.
Yeah. No, it sounds very powerful to me how you describe it. And I've seen this in slightly modified versions as well, where you create a space where you listen well, now full focus on the other person, and then your task is to reflect that back. So where you can share while knowing what you're sharing is not your own emotion or your own story, but the story of another. And I think that's very important for us to keep this apart. This is your story. This is my story. So it goes far away. It goes a far way also for conflict resolution, and is often used in that context.
Right.
Let me throw some sticks under your legs.
Okay, cool.
Your legs to make it a little bit more complicated.
That's what I've been hoping for.
I know.
I'm looking for good, things that, like Paul Bloom. It just seems so like straw man stuff. I'm looking for real, real issues.
Thank you. Well, let's see what I can deliver that.
Okay.
So, you described my first dark side of empathy. So here's my second one. And in this case, there's several of my dark sides would respond to this version. I mean, I talk about vampiristic empathy at some point. We can come back to that. But right now, there's another one I want to come back to, which is the issue of conflict resolution, scenarios of three people, and side taking. So this is what I call polarization. I'm 100% with you to say that empathy is not just something that happens just between two people. There's social settings involved. There's usually more than two people or groups or parties involved, and so on and so on. But here's what empathy often does, I believe, is that it plays a dubious role in side-taking. When we observe other people interacting with each other, we tend to take a side. We are trained to that. I mean, sports games that we watch, or family disputes, how history is taught to us. It's always about little disputes and so on. We tune in when there's a conflict. And then what people do is they take very quickly a side, take the perspective of the chosen side. It can be arbitrary. They can choose their side, their friends, and so on. And there's reasons why you choose a side, but sometimes there's none, or it could be that you try out a side. There can be many reasons why. That doesn't interest me why you take that side originally. But once you take that side, people tend to take that perspective. Then they see, oh yeah, they have a right to feel bad, or they have a right to feel angry at the other person because the other person did this and this. And then you start to develop empathy for their cause. You copy their emotions and say, yes, they're right. I understand their journey. You go along with their journey. And along the way, you start to demonize the other side. Not indirectly, because the other side can be seen as the culprit or someone who inflicted something on it. So empathy here can be part of a practice that polarizes, that brings people apart, where the other side is the bad side. This can be small in sports kind of events where fans tend to really not dislike other groups, but this can have large political consequences. I mean, this can go to terrorists who empathize with their cause, their people, who they feel being suppressed by others, and then they step in. So it's not a lack of empathy that drives these people. or at least not in a large sense of that, but rather one-sided empathy.
Okay, can I just reflect back my understanding? So you're saying if there's a conflict, there's two people in conflict and you're the third party, and then you hear the point of one side and you sort of like empathizing, feeling into their experience. You see maybe that they've been wronged or something, and then you sort of take their side, and then you're sort of not taking the side of the other person. And so you see that as sort of a problem with empathy, that you sort of take that side and then you just become, you're in a sense, you become one of the disputants in a sense.
Yes, you get swept up into it. You can still see yourself as outside of it. At least there's a tendency to this. Now, and here's an interesting case study that I want to add to that. But yes, that was correct first of all. This is a case study that concerns the school system from Northern Ireland, where the school teachers wanted to break a cycle of violence. Northern Ireland had a history of the so-called Troubles for more than, for basically 2 centuries or even more, between the Catholic and the Protestant population. And this was, is still underlying there. We have now, luckily, for almost 10 years, we had a fairly quiet phase finally. But in the early 2000s, there was a large school experiment driven by the middle school history teachers. Their reasoning was that it's that time period, middle school, when the kids develop a political identity and figure out they're either Protestant or Catholic, and become polarized. So they tried to develop a new understanding of curriculum that was based on empathy, where they could do something that sounded not quite as specific as you described in the circle of empathy, where you do active listening and then reflect back the story of the other one, but where something similar happened on a curricular level, where they wanted to make sure that all kids, Protestant or Protestants, could tell of the suffering of the Catholics. But they could also talk about the suffering of the Protestants, about the misery that happened in certain events. And they were tested on this. They had to say, can you tell us the story? Do you know what happened to these people? And what drove them and give them their own plight? And so that seemed to work. So the first level of success was the students were understanding it. They would not just ignore some material, they would all start. However, then researchers, including one of my colleagues here as a leading researcher, Keith Barton, at Indiana University School of Education, went back and did qualitative interviews with those school kids who went through this curriculum. This was a large initiative in many, many schools with new materials and everything. And they found out that when they interviewed these kids, that they were more polarized than the kids before. Even though they could tell both sides of the story, they knew which side was theirs. So somehow they got away from it. There's always 2 sides, and they knew very much what is their side. So they abandoned this project.
Okay, so this training, they were showing the different sides, but it was creating, when the students were kind of studying this, it made them even identify with their side even more.
Yes, it somewhat backfired, exactly.
So it's sort
try to have so it's very, what I'm saying now, there are specific things about this case. So my colleague Keith Barton suggests that maybe they could have done this better. They could have been played more on the emotions or something like that. There could have been ways to improve it. So it's not clear that it doesn't disprove.
It might not be a good example for.
Yes, exactly. But the attempt, we have to say, it was also not a very bad example, in the sense that these teachers very deliberately wanted to deliver empathy for both sides, and they were not. It was not a naive attempt either. So
attempts at creating empathy can go wrong depending on how they're sort of framed, and they could have negative consequences in a sense.
And they can lead to the exclusion of others, even when people are trying to not use that. So conflict resolution is not can be blocked by empathy. It's not as simple as to say, once the 2 sides develop empathy for each other, once they go through the circle of empathy, you can put it to a side.
Okay, well, I would say that it's unclear to me kind of the dynamics of that scenario. They could have just done a bad job of the way they structure it. And I can tell a story that I think that will illustrate it and is scalable. So, you know, my family, you know, I've tried to talk to them about empathy and stuff, and you know, they're very conservative, and they didn't understand what I was really meaning. But then, you know, 6-7 years ago, a conflict started in my family. So my sister-in-law was really mad at my mother because the kids had gotten into the gifts during Christmas, on Christmas. And she said, you know, she was like, oh, you put these gifts in a place where the kids could get it, and they were like tearing everything apart before, you know, the time to get into the gifts. And she said, you know, it's all your fault. And she was like really mad. My mother turned around and said, don't talk to me that way. You know, so she was mad that she was being talked to in what she considered a demeaning sort of a way. And so, I mean, it was getting really heated. They were starting to, you know, point and yell at each other. And it looked like Christmas was going to blow up, right? Everybody's going to go home angry. So I thought, okay, I'm Mr. Empathy here. I have to deal with this. So here's two sides, and here's Mr. Empathy coming into it. So what I did is I empathized with both sides. I didn't take sides because I think that the side taking is a block to empathy. So I would actually say that what you're calling, you know, so for my sister-in-law, I only did empathic listening. So I stepped in, I said, and all the rest of the family were hiding. They were going behind the sofas into the corners, like, oh, we don't know how to deal with
shelter.
The shelter, exactly. And so and it was very nervous. It's very scary to step in empathically into a conflict. It can be. I mean, I was like,
especially in your own family too. Where you have, exactly,
I was shaking. I felt fear to the core of my body, but I stepped in. And I listened to my sister-in-law. I said, oh, what I hear is you're feeling really upset that, you know, the kids got into the gift, and you're feeling, you know, my mother is responsible. You know, I just did the empathic listening with her until she felt heard. You know, it took, you know, a minute or two. And then I talked to my mother and said, oh, are you feeling upset that you know, you're being talked to this way? She said, yes. And then she explained a bit more. And then I listened to the sister-in-law for a little bit. And then so I started listening. I didn't take sides. I could have immediately said, oh, you're right. It's, you know, you're talking terrible to my mother. I just said, what is it that what are you experiencing? I'm on your journey. Let me go on your journey with you, and let's explore all the different ramifications of your journey. And then I went to my mother and did the same thing, explored the ramifications. And we went back and forth, you know, maybe 20 minutes, you know. And then I said, would you now listen to each other and reflect back your understanding of what you hear the other person say? And once that person feels heard and understood to their satisfaction, it will be your turn to speak, and they will hear you to your satisfaction. I said, okay, we'll try this. Because when they started feeling heard, they started calming down, right? They started getting calmer, more relaxed. I mean, they were still pretty angry with each other. But then they did it, and one person spoke to the other, and then they would say something, the other person would be upset, and they want to lash back. And I said, no, just reflect back what you heard them say. In a sense, go on their journey with them. And then, you know, maybe something on the journey upset them and they wanted to go off on their own journey, you know. And I said, no, just stick with them. And then, so we went back and forth, and they actually did it. They were able, you know, I kept them on track. And then the whole family came slowly out of the corners. They came in, and it turned into this family empathy circle. And we went for, you know, well over an hour. And a deeper issue came up that the sister-in-law felt, oh, you know, your family, you're more well-to-do financially. I come from a poor family. I'm not accepted in this. And a whole different topic came up, a sense of not feeling included, not feeling, you know, heard, seen, and, you know, valued. And then my father got up and said, you know, we love you, or I love you, you know, you've given me these beautiful grandchildren, you know, I care about you. and they got up in the middle of the room, they hugged with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kept going, and the same thing happened with her, my sister, and my mother, and it ended on a, with a sense of connection, sort of an integration, mutual understanding, and so that's what I would say is the empathy with those students that you're talking about. If they had done empathy circles instead of kind of getting sort of an intellectual maybe understanding being tested, if they had had a chance to dialogue with each other in an empathic way, I think it would have had a different outcome. I think it would have had an outcome as the same with my family. I think that is scalable. That practice.
Yeah. Is it scalable or not? I mean, thank you for sharing, first of all. That's a powerful story. And anyone who listens to this can immediately imagine how that could have played out and how well that worked in that case. Now, of course, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's scalable or not, what you described, because, of course, you talk about a situation where you are already a family. I mean, there is also immense pressure. This happens as the grandchildren are involved, of course, they're there, and so on and so on. So you have an audience where you know that everyone no one wants to disappoint that audience. So in a certain sense, that there is a pressure that you don't have on a typical political scenario or so, or a cultural divide, where the jointness is not there. If a nation is not the same as a family, where you really know ultimately you have the interest here, that we all have one interest. That is often not so clear for people. So I think in cases like South Africa or the Palestinians in Israel, or also the case of Northern Ireland, I'm not sure whether that can work the same way there, or where you can have, even worse, you can have moments of bridging divides for a short time, but then you have kind of this swinging dynamic of backlashes that go then even more extremely against it again. I mean, so some of the practices that on political and cultural divides we have actually for that reason kind of abandoned empathy. The truth and reconciliation process that worked, I mean, did it work 100%? No. Is it perfect? No. But that at least led to a fairly peaceful transition in South Africa. We should not forget that. Kind of put empathy completely out of the equation. The goal was not to be one world family, not to embrace each other. The scars were too deep, but to move on, find a way that one can cooperate. So there may be cases where that you describe where really the empathy circle can be very appropriate, can be wonderful. I mean, bringing people together, also bringing other issues out, deeper issues, like what you described there about your sister-in-law, then being able to share her sense that she didn't feel accepted by the family. That is big. That's big, that she was able to articulate that, to bring it into the form of words, and thereby also make it a topic so that people could react to it to say, oh, that is behind this. There's a fear in this here. Maybe that drives overreactions or strong reactions, and then one can address it. That is very wonderful. But I don't think in political scenarios or larger groups that is always something that will happen. There you can have much more dubious reactions.
Yeah, you're kind of skeptical that it could scale up and it could work in different situations, and
and you need in your case, somehow I think the parties accepted that you were in the middle here, that you were not automatically backing up your own mother, or that you would take the one or the other side. You must have come across as very believable in this too, and there's not always such a figure who can do that.
There's a lot of skepticism in terms of, is this person really, and are they taking one side or the other? So there can be skepticism of the person that's sort of taking the mediation sort of stance. So
exactly.
I mean, it's a big topic, to really unravel, all that, because that's something we do. We have something called the empathy tent. We go to these political rallies. So as you know, there's been these battles of Berkeley. Political right wing comes to Berkeley, the left counter comes, and there's these, physical knockdown, drag out, fist fights and, people get bloody and all that kind of stuff. So we have gone into these environments and tried to sort of mediate, and we have done mediations that have worked, really well. So I see that it's scalable. It's difficult because of all the different factors you're talking about. But I would say that the underlying core is the empathic approach. That if we can take an empathic approach, there's a lot of blocks. There's, entrenched interests, there's, mistrust, but that it's not the fault of empathy itself. It's more the fault of the thing that blocks it is, fear or anger or so forth. That it's the empathy itself is not the problem.
No.
The things that is blocking it. And within the mediation community, I'm concerned about the time because we've gone an hour. I can talk forever, so I just want to be sure how long I can talk.
I still have a little bit of time. There's someone will come here at some point.
Okay, then we can.
We have more topics.
Good, because there's something within the mediation field called the drama triangle. I don't know if you ever heard of that term, but the drama triangle says that there's a victim, perpetrator, and rescuer. So someone, and it happens, in kind of at all scales. So in the family, it could have been, if I had acted in the drama triangle structure, when my sister-in-law criticized my mother, I could have taken my mother's position. I could go and rescue her, which is, I think, what you're talking about is this drama triangle.
Yes, I actually now know what you mean yes.
So you go to rescue the who you see as the victim, and then in the process of trying to rescue the victim, you have turned the persecutor into the victim, right? The persecutor then thinks that they're the victim, and the roles keep changing in terms of who is the victim, who is the rescuer. And it's just it's this never ending, kind of a process, this trap you kind of get into. And that the breakthrough of the drama triangle I see as empathy, because I did not take the side of either person. I took the side of empathy. I said, I'm going to empathize with you. I'm going to empathize with you. I'm going to empathize with you. So I took an empathic role. And then the culture of empathy is I want a culture where we all empathize with each other. So I am going to support you in hearing each other. And so I did not see either of them as a victim or either of them as a perpetrator. I saw them as just human beings with their own experience and that needed to be heard and seen and acknowledged. And then, my grounding is in a culture of empathy. I support empathy, for you and for each other. And so that is how you break out. I think empathy is how you break out of the drama triangle. So you don't take sides, you listen to all sides, and you try to support the sides in having empathy with each other.
Yeah. I can see that can work, of course, especially for someone like you who is highly trained in this, where you have cultivated a form of empathy that gives you a mind and consciousness a high degree of mobility. So when you can empathize with one person, listen to a story, engage in active listening, but then when you talk to someone else, you still can, your mind, you can clear your mind enough that you can also now focus on the other person. I think that we can learn this, and some people are good or better at that than others. And it's a goal of education for us as a civil society that we accomplish that. But I also do think that in practical terms, most people tend to kind of not being as able to move their empathy from one side to the next, or they stay somewhat committed to this one side once they are in what you described as the drama triangle or the mind club, as I know it from once you kind of see someone in one role, you really relate to someone whom you see as the victim of someone else. That may be so strong that you can't, for many people, that they cannot leave that besides, and then they will act upon this. Not everyone will become a terrorist, not everyone will become a radical or so, but many people will kind of have a much more one-sided view of situations and won't be easily able to switch the side. That is a goal. And I agree that empathy can play a fantastic role here to overcome conflict. But for many people, that's not the case. And then what is interesting is not only that they can't do it, but then empathy plays a diabolic role in this, that it actually enhances their side taking, that it verifies that they have chosen the right side because they see their side as, let's say, the victim or the correct side. And empathy helps them to feel correct in their choice because they share the feelings of that person. They see how that fits into it. So I know that you would call that a blocking of empathy for the others. Stuck on it. But for that, if they follow that person, the other person or the other group, there is something that they can stay committed to their journey and their side while ignoring the others. So it's not that it's really completely not empathy. It's also not a complete blocking of empathy towards them. No, they allow themselves to go very far along with them.
Yeah, well, I would say it's this thing, the same thing we're talking about with the sympathy and state matching, is that empathy is sort of intertwined in all these experiences. And we start maybe with empathy, but then we lose the empathy. So when people start taking sides, it's not the empathy itself that's at fault. I mean, they are maybe empathizing with someone, but it's when they lose their empathy that the problem starts. So I for me, it's an empathy deficit that is the problem, not the empathy itself. The empathy itself is, like you say, we're sort of awash in empathy. And it's more like, how do we train, learn, practice in society? I mean, there's a huge empathy deficit, as Barack Obama had talked about.
No, but I mean, if you have one, sorry to interrupt you here.
No.
I do think, I think it's even more problematic in this case. It's not just an empathy deficit or just an empathy wash, because I think it's a one-sided empathy. And I think if you have one-sided empathy for the one side, but not the other sides, it is still empathy. So I think it's a little bit simplistic to call that empathy deficit.
Well, the deficit is empathy for both sides.
I know, I agree. I know what you say there, but like,
if we frame it in a relational, cultural, if we frame it in an individualistic way, it looks from an individualist, it maybe looks like there's empathy, but if you frame it within a relational, that we are, and I would say that relationship is a human truth. We are in relationship. We are in an environment. We are in a culture, that of relation. So it kind of depends on how you're seeing it.
Yeah, that's why I would suggest actually using different terms for this. There could be a general empathy deficit of having low empathy throughout. Then there could be, then there could be, let's say, on the very positive spectrum, there could be what you describe as a culture of empathy, where people have accomplished this mobility of empathy to apply it in many life situations and have learned it and are continuously learning at it. But then what I'm describing here, I think is really, I would call it in this case, a one-sided empathy. And it can be a deep empathy for one person. So that's why I'm saying, yes, it would not be well described as empathy deficit. There could be highly empathetic people who are only just kind of employing it one-sided. And that's important, because that is, I think, that's something in the middle there. I understand that it wouldn't accomplish what you would call culture of empathy, but I think it would be falsely labeled as a deficit of empathy either. Because empathy is there, it's just not broadened out in that sense. And that danger of this one-sided empathy, where empathy then becomes involved in negative practices, needs to be looked at in different ways.
So you're saying that there's one person that you are empathizing with, you're being aware of who they are, and that is empathy. You're saying that is empathic.
Yeah, I think that's at least, I would not say that we automatically have to assume that they are there's an empathy deficit. It is on some level, but it's much more something. It's in the middle of the spectrum here in some strange sense. So I'm not a specialist on terrorism, let's say. But if you look at the stories of some of the masterminds of terrorism, including the mastermind who died in the attacks of the 9/11 attacks, this person, it doesn't strike, from everything we know about him, it was not that he was a psychopath or that he lacked empathy altogether. I mean, he was very introverted apparently, but he in fact had developed a very huge bonding towards what he saw, in his case, an original Islamic culture that was intruded by the West. And in particular, he was, I mean, of course, he studied, his master thesis was on skyscrapers, how skyscrapers destroyed the original good Arabic landscape. So I mean, he had a strong feeling of pain and victimization that drove him. So obviously, he's a monster in his actions, and revealed something that is incredibly horrible and inflicted a lot of pain on others. But it's not well described to say, oh, he lacked empathy. No. He channeled his empathy completely one-sided. And that's interesting. It has specific challenges for us to say, so how do we deal with this? How can we learn to overcome this, to not using empathy to enforce one-sidedness, polarization?
Mm-hmm. Yes, but you had used the word victimization, which is part of the drama triangle. When he started seeing victims, his community as victims, he shifted out of empathy, because as soon as you start seeing people as victims or victimizing them, you're no longer really empathic. So it could be that whole sympathy, criticism of, sympathy being a problem, that it's maybe the sympathy, the feeling sorry for sort of this narcissistic self, it's about me and, my grievances, instead of staying present and empathizing, is how I would see it. Because, so it's like he started,
yes,
it's like it's kind of like these those where the ball, you have one ball and it hits other balls, and there's a chain of events, right? It's like this happens and then this happens, but there's a lot of different events that are happening in between. He sees this issue, and then he does this action. I see you're maybe. So we could talk for hours. I think
this is
great. Maybe we can even follow up if you have time to do a follow up. I don't want to keep you if you have an appointment or something.
Yeah, if you want, yes, I have someone waiting there for me. Indeed, exactly. I scheduled it for an hour here. I hear what you say. Don't worry. This is something that I think.
I get it.
There's I think the key difference that we two have here is not, I think, that we necessarily disagree about the phenomena or something like that. I think we can describe how things that we both describe here can happen, and whether they're regrettable or not, we agree and seem to agree on that. I think it's ultimately then, I would say, that it's more in a way our interests. You are interested in to see how empathy can lead, and well cultivated and trained empathy can lead to overcome conflicts, can overcome bad forms of dependency, self-loss, or some of the other dark sides of empathy that is described, like vampirism, sadism or so, and it can lead you not to fall off the tracks, to lead to false empathy or abusive empathy or victim-focused empathy, which stops being empathy. But we agree about all of that. So my difference comes in here to simply say, well, yes, empathy might be able to overcome this, but it's also interesting to see how easily empathy for many people can switch or drop from starting out somewhere, can motivate people to be one-sided, to dwell on the victimization or get caught up in it, or even take pleasure out of the pain of others, out of an empathetic impulse. You would say that then that they would have fallen off the track of
right.
Empathy. And I would say maybe, I don't disagree with it, but I would say, but it happens. And it happens a lot. And empathy, maybe in our cultural setting, in some cases even promotes dark and evil actions.
See, what I'm saying,
I'm looking at it more statistically to see empathy happens, and this is what it gets caught up in. And you look at it as a saying, from the standpoint of a therapist, how it could be, how it can be brought back on track.
Yeah.
And that's good. So both sides actually I think they actually help each other. You need to know, from your perspective, to know what can go wrong, to say, oh no, okay, this is where it stops being empathy. So these are the challenges. So in that sense, I think that actually does.
So it's like, here's the empathy and here's the block. So you're kind of, how I would look at what you're saying is, here's all these different blocks to empathy. So for me, it's not what you're describing is not, and which is, and very articulately, I kind of wish that you were on the side of really promoting empathy, because you're very articulate.
I do promote empathy.
You do, yeah. You're very articulate. You're very nuanced. I really appreciate the depth of your thoughtfulness. But it's like, I'm seeing the empathy and then the blocks to empathy, and then how do we overcome those blocks, and how do we strengthen it? Like, if empathy is a muscle, we all have muscles, right? But some people have their muscles more developed, more strengthened, and we need to, but we can't blame muscles. If somebody can't lift something, we can't blame them for having muscles. We have to say, the problem is they haven't strengthened their muscles. They haven't done the exercises. They haven't learned the skills. And so that's kind of the essence that I'm saying, is we need to strengthen those muscles, learn those skills. And if you have a block, something that we need to learn to overcome those blocks. And it's sort of unfair to blame the blocks on the empathy itself. You can't blame the lack of being able to do something physically on your muscles, because it's just that the muscles haven't been developed adequately for the task. So
I mean, I see what you're saying there. I would still say, well, some of these bad paths or the blocks, they seem to be part of the architecture of empathy for me. I'm slightly less optimistic, although we do agree that ultimately I think that empathy should be learned, should be trained more. We need more and less of empathy, all in all. Though we have to learn to avoid some traps. We agree.
So you're saying that the traps themselves are sort of like a component of empathy.
That's
the component
of empathy
in a lot, is sort of leading to these sort of traps.
Yes, but one can learn to kind of cultivate better forms of empathy. I believe in that strongly. So that's again.
We're on the same, and we both believe that we can nurture those.
Ultimately, I'm pro empathy. I mean, if push comes to shove, I would always say, no, we need more empathy. We need to learn it. We need to cultivate it in children, in the schools. They play a much bigger role in that. However, if we really want to do it right, then we also have to know about the dark sides of empathy. So
I would say we need to know about the blocks of empathy. So I wish we could kind of work, there's sort of a nut there to crack. Maybe we can, I would love to talk more, maybe even do an empathy circle too, that we actually have an empathy circle with some others and use the empathic listening so that you can actually sort of experience that too. So
that sounds great to me. That sounds great to me.
Oh, great. Well, this is fabulous. I love this discussion. I love the nuances and the thoughtfulness and how you sort of approach this. I disagree with some of really, for me, empathy is an integrative process. So it's the dialogue, the back and forth dialogue that sort of integrates our views and that we grow and expand. So I'm really grateful for you taking part in this dialogue, and to be continued, at least from my point of view.
Wonderful. I'm fully with you there. I thank you for having me, first of all, so that we could have that discussion. And there's food for thought for me in this too. So, and I also love your optimism and your relentlessness in this. So that is very good.
Oh, thank you for that. Okay, I'll